Welcome to session 12 of Mainstream Apologetics, our very last session. During this session, we will answer the question, how do I know Jesus rose from the dead? We will explore evidence for the resurrection. We begin this session by asking, don't all people believe in the resurrection? Well, not really. According to a recent Rasmussen and Barna poll, only 50 to 60% of the people in the U.S. believe in the resurrection. So why is the resurrection absolutely essential to the Christian faith? Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 15 that if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then our faith is useless and we are still dead in our sins. During this session, we will explore both direct evidence, such as eyewitness evidence, and indirect evidence, also known as circumstantial evidence. We begin this session with our first big idea. Jesus' resurrection was witnessed by hundreds of people and marked by dramatic conversions. To defend this claim, we explore evidence of an empty tomb, eyewitness evidence, and finally, conversion evidence. In our first line of inquiry into Jesus' resurrection, we explore evidence for the empty tomb. We begin this discussion with a detailed account of the extraordinary events surrounding Jesus' resurrection. These events include a violent earthquake, the appearance of angels, soldiers fainting, the stone rolled away and the Roman seal broken, missing Roman guards, an empty tomb discovered by women, Peter and John, and the discovery of a facial cloth and body linen or shroud. From this account, we make the following key observations. First and foremost, Jesus' body is unaccounted for. His body is no longer in the tomb, and none of those involved in this account can adequately explain the missing body. Second, the women who witnessed Jesus' death on the cross were the first to discover the empty tomb. What's remarkable about their testimony is that according to Jewish law, a woman's testimony was not admissible in court. For the gospel writers to include the women's testimony, they would have had to scrutinize the testimony to ensure it was authentic. The women's testimony was corroborated in part by Peter and John's testimony, who soon after discovered the empty tomb. And finally, Mark's resurrection account was likely written in AD 37, approximately 5 years after the actual event. Also, Peter's resurrection testimonies in the book of Acts and Paul's creedal statement found in 1 Corinthians 15 were likely delivered within 7 years after the resurrection. So what can account for the empty tomb? There are really only two explanations. Either Jesus' body was stolen by persons unknown, or Jesus rose from the dead and vacated his tomb. We note that the stolen body theory is very unlikely. First, the disciples were cowering behind locked doors for fear of being arrested. Second, the Roman soldiers would have been executed for failing to uphold their duties. And third, the Pharisees would not have stolen the body. They wanted Jesus to remain buried. So we're left with the resurrection as the most reasonable explanation. In our second line of inquiry into Jesus' resurrection, we explore eyewitness evidence. As we mentioned in our last session, Jesus' crucifixion was a public event. Thousands of people witnessed his certain death by crucifixion. Likewise, Jesus' post-resurrection appearances were witnessed by many people in public settings. These post-resurrection eyewitness testimonies serve as direct evidence. In a Jewish court of law, a minimum of 2 witnesses is required for a conviction, according to Deuteronomy 19:15. In a modern court of law, people can be convicted with the testimony of just 1 witness, if the jury believes the testimony is beyond a reasonable doubt. In the case of Jesus' resurrection, there were 500 plus witnesses. Certainly, this amount of eyewitness evidence would more than satisfy the beyond reasonable doubt test and convince a jury that Jesus rose from the dead. The table shown on this slide enumerates all 13 of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. As you can see from this table, there is great diversity. Jesus appeared to different people at different times in different locations. Jesus appeared over a period of 40 days. He appeared immediately after his resurrection, during the weeks following his resurrection, and finally at his ascension. He even appeared to Paul after the ascension. Jesus appeared in a variety of locations. These locations range from the northern region of Galilee to the southern region of Judea. Finally, Jesus appeared to a great number of witnesses. He first appeared to those in his inner circle, and then to his brother James, and then finally to the other disciples and to the general public. If we do the math, he appeared to at least 520 people. Since we know that the Gospels are not exhaustive, we can assume that Jesus appeared to many more people. In summary, there are 13 separate post-resurrection accounts recorded in the New Testament that occurred over the course of 40 days to 520 plus people. Additional information provided by Luke and Paul further clarifies the nature of Jesus' appearances. In Acts 1:3, Luke writes, "During the 40 days after he suffered and died, he appeared to his apostles from time to time, and he proved to them in many ways that he was actually alive." From this passage, we learn that Jesus proved in many ways to the apostles that he was alive. This phrase, "proved in many ways," implies that Jesus wanted to convince his followers beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was alive. And in fact, the establishment and preservation of the New Testament church rests entirely on this conviction. We know from the many resurrection accounts that Jesus exhibited signs of his scourging and crucifixion, such as the marks from the nails on his hands and feet. He was recognized despite his many injuries. He had a physical, human nature. He could walk, talk, and eat. His disciples could touch him. And finally, he was fully healed of his many conditions and injuries incurred during the scourging and crucifixion. Next, we look at the Pauline Creed found in 1 Corinthians 15. In verse 6 we read, "He appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep." While Paul's letter to the Corinthians was written in approximately AD 53 to 56, this creed originated at a much earlier date. Paul's testimony implies that he received this oral tradition regarding Jesus' post-resurrection appearances from another, most likely Peter in AD 36. In this passage, Paul challenges the Corinthians to confirm the facts of the resurrection with the many eyewitnesses who are still alive. Essentially, he is saying, if you don't believe me, ask these people. In our third line of inquiry into Jesus' resurrection, we explore conversion evidence. The phrase "seeing is believing" is human nature. Often we're not convinced of something until we've experienced concrete evidence or proof. Such is the case with Jesus' disciples and the first century Christians. When we speak of conversions, we are referring to watershed moments that occur after an extraordinary encounter. These encounters mark a turning point where people fundamentally change. Let's look at the conversion of Jesus' closest disciples, the 12 apostles. We learn from the gospel accounts that during Jesus' passion, the disciples were anything but loyal to their calling as apostles. This is evidenced by the following events: the disciples fleeing from the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was arrested, Peter's repeated denial of Jesus, and the disciples cowering behind locked doors for fear of their lives. However, after encountering the risen Jesus, their lives were radically changed. They went from being unbelievers and cowards to being believers and bold proclaimers of the gospel message. We learn from church history that each one of them later were martyred. Next, we look at the conversion of Saul of Tarsus, who later became the Apostle Paul. Prior to his encounter with the risen Jesus, Paul was a fervid Pharisee. He was granted permission from the Jewish high priest to arrest Christians and bring them back to Jerusalem to face trial. However, after encountering the risen Jesus on the road to Damascus, Paul's life was forcibly and radically changed. He went from being a persecutor to being a believer and bold proclaimer. He too was later martyred for his faith. In our fourth and final line of inquiry into Jesus' death by crucifixion, we focus on circumstantial evidence. We continue in this series with our second big idea. Circumstantial evidence strongly supports the death and resurrection of Jesus. The phenomenal events surrounding Jesus' passion support the supernatural resurrection of Jesus. While these events are circumstantial, they strongly support the claim of Jesus' resurrection because of their quantity, diversity, proximity, and coincidence. Circumstantial evidence is also referred to as indirect evidence. Unlike direct or eyewitness evidence, circumstantial evidence is evidence that relies on inference to connect the evidence to the assertion. Using this process, we infer that the circumstances, the evidence, are connected to the resurrection, the assertion. The first set of circumstances we examine is the prolonged darkness and earthquakes that occurred at the time of Jesus' death. In Matthew 27:45 we read, "At noon darkness fell across the whole land until 3 o'clock." Later in Matthew 27, verse 54, we read, "The Roman officer and the other soldiers at the crucifixion were terrified by the earthquake and all that had happened." These cataclysmic events coincided in time and space with Jesus' death. These circumstantial events recorded in the Bible are corroborated by extra-biblical writers. First, we explore the ancient writings of Thallus, a Greek historian. He writes, "On the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake, and many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness appears to me without reason." Thallus' writings suggest that the darkness was fearful because of its scope and duration. He explicitly mentions that this darkness was observed everywhere, using the term whole world. He concluded that these events were extraordinary and could not be explained. Finally, we explore the ancient writings of Flagon, a prolific Greek historian. Flagon writes, "In the 4th year of the 202nd Olympiad, there was an eclipse of the sun, greater than any which had occurred previously. At the 6th hour, the day became as dark as night, and the stars were visible in the sky." These events recorded by Flagon likely occurred during the Olympiad held in AD 29 to 33. What was unusual about Flagon's account is that the 202nd Olympiad was held in Bithynia, which is located approximately 800 miles north of Jerusalem. This implies that the darkness and earthquakes were widespread throughout the entire regions of Israel and Asia Minor. We know from modern astronomy that this 3-hour prolonged darkness was not a natural event that could be attributed to an eclipse. We can only attribute this prolonged darkness to the supernatural work of God. It's God's way of signifying the gravity of Jesus' death. These extra-biblical testimonies corroborate the biblical accounts found in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The second set of circumstances we examine is the open tombs and the resurrection of the saints. In Matthew 27, we read that the earth shook and tombs were opened, and that many godly men and women were raised from the dead. They later appeared to many people in Jerusalem. Matthew's mention of these saints appearing to many people after their resurrection is significant. It's important to note that the Gospel of Matthew was written sometime between AD 55 and 80. Many of Matthew's readers would have been alive at the time these events occurred. Therefore, their encounter with those who were raised validates Matthew's account. The third set of circumstances we examine is the abrupt ending of long-standing temple phenomena. During the time of the high priest Simon the Just, from approximately BC 380 to 312, certain temple phenomena occurred during the Yom Kippur service with absolute regularity. These phenomena include the lot for God always selected by the right hand. The crimson wool tied around the scapegoat's neck always turns white. The candelabra in the Holy of Holies burned continually without requiring oil, and the sanctuary doors always remain closed. However, after Simon the Just's death in BC 312, these phenomena did not occur with regularity, but only occurred occasionally. And then finally, during the 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, these phenomena ceased to occur altogether. This table shows how these three temple periods coincide with Jesus' resurrection and the destruction of the Second Temple. The thing to note is that the complete cessation of these temple phenomena coincided with Jesus' resurrection in approximately AD 30 to 33. According to the Jerusalem Talmud, the cessation of these phenomena were the result of God's disfavor with the nation of Israel. When we turn to the New Testament, we learn that the rejection of Jesus as Messiah and the rejection of God the Holy Spirit were the final transgressions in a long sequence of Israel's moral decline. Ultimately, God's disfavor with Israel culminated in the destruction of the temple in AD 70. The fourth set of circumstances we examine is the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin is allegedly the burial cloth used to wrap Jesus' body during his initial burial. It bears the image of a person who was brutally scourged and crucified. The Shroud of Turin was discovered sometime before 1357. We know this because the earliest written account of the Shroud of Turin, the Diarchus Memorandum, was written in 1357. Therefore, we can establish that if the Shroud of Turin is a forgery, it must have been forged earlier than 1357. The Shroud of Turin has been the subject of scientific inquiry for many years. Therefore, there is a large corpus of scientific, forensic, and historical evidence related to the shroud. Based on this evidence, we at Mainstream Apologetics believe that the Shroud of Turin accurately depicts the post-mortem characteristics of the crucified body of Jesus, and is very likely the genuine burial shroud of Jesus. The first line of inquiry into the Shroud of Turin confirms that the features on the shroud are consistent with the details found in the Gospel accounts. When we examine the Gospel accounts, we identify 13 distinct physical features related to Jesus' death and crucifixion. When we examine the Shroud of Turin, we come to realize that all 13 features are depicted on the shroud. Based on the Gospel accounts, Jesus' scourging and crucifixion were atypical. The Shroud of Turin depicts a number of features that were unique to Jesus. These include abrasions and puncture wounds on the forehead and scalp, and a swollen cheek. This is from the crown of thorns and the beatings. And the lack of embalming ointment on the body, because Jesus' body was not fully embalmed. We conclude that the Shroud of Turin is an accurate visual record of the brutal scourging and crucifixion unique to Jesus. The second line of inquiry into the Shroud of Turin confirms that the floral imprints and pollen grains found on the shroud are endemic to Israel and the surrounding area in the 1st century. It was customary that a floral wreath be placed around the head of a deceased in Jewish burials. The wreath depicted on the shroud is comprised of native flowers. Pollens from the flowers and other plants were also found on the shroud. Scholars from the Israel Antiquities Authority determined that the imprints and pollen represented on the shroud were chrysanthemum and 3 other native flowers. Chrysanthemum petals can be clearly seen in the image on the top right. They further determined that these flowers could only have come from the Middle East and were only in bloom during the months of February through May. These facts coincide with both the location and the time of Jesus' burial. This evidence strongly suggests that the shroud was exposed to these native plants during the 1st century and could not have been introduced in a 14th century forgery. The third line of inquiry into the Shroud of Turin confirms that the scourge marks found on the shroud are consistent with the Roman flagrum used in the 1st century. Details of the Roman flagrum were unknown until one was unearthed in the ancient city of Herculaneum in 1709. This artifact was buried in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79, which places it within 47 years of Jesus' crucifixion. As you can clearly see, the scourge marks on the shroud are consistent with the dumbbell-shaped tips on the flagrum. Here are 4 compelling reasons why these scourge marks could not have been forged. First, the discovery of the 1st century flagrum postdates an alleged 14th century forgery. Second, the dumbbell-shaped scourge marks are only visible with ultraviolet light, a technology unavailable in the 14th century. Third, all 100 scourge marks are identical in shape and dimensions, and could not have been forged by hand with such precision. And finally, knowledge of blood clotting seen in the serum halos surrounding the scourge marks was unknown in the 14th century. We conclude that this evidence further authenticates the Shroud of Turin as the genuine burial shroud of Jesus. The fourth inquiry into the Shroud of Turin confirms that knowledge of certain medical conditions depicted on the shroud were unknown to medical science in the 14th century. A condition known as pleural effusion is the buildup of various fluids between the layers of tissue that line the lungs and the chest cavity. According to John 19:34, blood and water were released when the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear. On the shroud, the blood serum was less concentrated near the pleural cavity than in other areas. Additionally, the condition known as abdomen distension is a buildup of various fluids and air in the abdomen. This buildup of fluid and air causes the abdomen to bulge outward. A distended or swollen abdomen is clearly visible on the shroud. Pleural effusion and the precise location of the pleural cavity and abdomen distension were unknown in the 14th century. These conditions weren't discovered by medical science until the 18th century. There are many other features present on the shroud for which the scientific community cannot explain. In a modern court of law, the diversity of the circumstantial evidence would be considered legitimate proof of Jesus' resurrection. In terms of its nature, this evidence is both supernatural, such as the resurrection, temple phenomena, and prolonged darkness, and natural, such as widespread earthquakes. In terms of location, this evidence was observed in locations ranging from Jerusalem to the northernmost regions of Asia Minor. In terms of source, this evidence was sourced by a wide range of authors, such as biblical writers, early church fathers, rabbis, and other notable historians. These authors represent Christian, Jewish, and pagan perspectives. And in terms of the dating of sources, this evidence is based on both prophecy and historical accounts. Together, the direct evidence presented earlier in this session, along with the circumstantial evidence, solidifies the claim of Jesus' resurrection. Therefore, we conclude this session by reiterating our 2 big ideas. Jesus was raised from the dead because of the multitude of eyewitnesses who were forever marked by his resurrection, and by the plethora of circumstantial evidence which corroborates the biblical accounts. We at Mainstream Apologetics are glad that you decided to join us for this training series in Christian apologetics. We hope you found these materials both informative and helpful. For further information on any one of these topics, please avail yourself to the online resources provided at mainstreamapologetics.org. Once again, we want to provide you with a time for reflection. If you're in a group, please discuss these questions. Otherwise, please answer these questions individually.